My name is Chloe, and this story happened to me 2 weeks ago. I'm 32 years old and have a 10-year-old son named Jesse. Every now and then, the company I work for requires me to travel across the state and other parts of the country to take place in important business meetings that are mandatory for me to attend. Thankfully, my bosses are understanding of the situation. Jesse's father isn't in the picture, so my work allows me to bring Jesse with me on business trips. Most of the time, we stay in a rented lodge or an apartment. A few weeks ago, I had to go on another business trip. It was out in the country, which was nice because the house me and Jesse will be staying in was a real small lodge, which was very secluded. The night before the meeting, I was on a Zoom call with my colleagues at around 10 p.m. while Jesse was upstairs playing on his Nintendo Switch. During my Zoom call, Jesse called me from upstairs telling me I need to see something. I excused myself from the call and headed upstairs. I went into his room and asked him what was wrong. He told me there was a man outside looking up into his window. I looked out into the dark field and couldn't see anything. I told Jesse I couldn't see anybody out there. He said the man walked off into the darkness as he called for me. What he said concerned me, but I had to brush it off as maybe it was a dog walker or something. I usually think rationally when it comes to things like that. I told Jesse to tell me if he sees the man again. I then returned to my Zoom call. About an hour went by when one of my bosses suggested we took a quick bathroom and drink break. Leaving the Zoom call on as we usually do, I went to put a pot of tea on and went upstairs to check how Jesse was. I asked if he was okay and if he saw anything outside. He told me he hadn't seen anybody since. I tucked Jesse in the bed and went back downstairs to continue my business call on Zoom. Most of the colleagues were back on from the break, apart from a couple. One of my bosses said, "Oh, that's strange. I thought I just saw you walking around the kitchen." The laptop that I was using for the call was set on the table in the living room, which was opposite the kitchen, which also had a back door. I replied saying no, I was just upstairs. He said he was certain that he saw me walking around the kitchen. I laughed and I told him he was seeing things. My pot of tea started to boil. I had forgot about it. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed the back door was slightly open. I thought it was odd, especially being what my boss just said to me. But I chalked it up to Jesse forgetting to close the door. He was outside playing earlier that day after all. I closed it and locked the door, poured myself some tea and sat down to continue my Zoom call. About 10 minutes go by and I started to feel funny, like really sleepy all of a sudden, but it wasn't a normal feeling. I felt fine and all of a sudden I felt like I couldn't keep my eyes open. And that's what happened. I fell asleep on the Zoom call. I didn't know at the time, but I was out for about 10 minutes until I woke up to Jesse frantically pulling me, trying to wake me up. He told me there was a man outside trying to get in. I turned around, I saw a man on the other side of the back door pulling the door handle in an aggressive way. He looked furious, as he couldn't get inside. This means that what my boss said to me earlier, when he thought he saw me in the kitchen, was true. That man did get in the house as I was upstairs checking on Jesse. He must have spiked my tea, and that's what made me fall unconscious. Once unconscious, I think he was planning to enter the house and assuming the door was still unlocked to take my son away. The thought of this makes me sick to my stomach. I thank God that I noticed the door slightly open and locked it shut. This story could have had an awful ending otherwise. We called the police and they searched the area, and not surprisingly, they found no one. Jesse and I returned home after that. This incident will haunt me for the rest of my life, and Jesse's too.
Hi, I'm Natalie and I'm a yoga teacher out here in Portland, Oregon. About this time last year, I had my own studio, a burgeoning list of clients, and a profit margin I was really proud of. But then, the pandemic hit, and business pretty much dropped off overnight. I was going to have to radically rework my business model if my business was going to survive, and for about a week, I was stressing out about what I was going to do. Then it hit me. I was hearing a lot about some video calling app called Zoom in the media and how it was helping businesses continue trading despite strict lockdown conditions. I figured if people could have a management meeting via webcam, I'd be able to teach a yoga class online. I was worried that some of my clients would be slow to warm up to the whole download dog idea. Sorry for the yoga joke, but to my delight, enough people signed up to pay my rent for the month, which was a huge weight off my mind. It took a few sessions for me to really get the hang of it, but after a while, I was hosting 2 sessions a day, 4 days a week, and business was still growing. Then, when I put in an ad on social media, interest exploded. People were trapped inside, bored out of their minds, and were craving some kind of self-improvement. It went from being the worst thing to happen to my business to something resembling the best thing. But having those Zoom yoga classes brought a whole host of problems. Some people lost connection to the call and demanded I Venmo their money back. Other people, setups weren't that great, so I couldn't properly advise them on their form. But the biggest thing, my yoga studio is in a commercial block behind a series of locked doors away from prying eyes. Interruptions and security have never been a problem, but random things were able to interrupt my clients, be it their cats or other, more terrifying things. So I'm running an afternoon session of about 10 to 12 clients and everything is going smoothly. Then suddenly, I start hearing something that kind of sounded like feedback coming from one of my clients' microphones. It steadily got louder and louder until curiosity got a hold of me and I had to ask them what the sound was. My client started looking a little anxious, apologized, then got up while saying she was going to shut a window. Me and these other ladies are watching our screens, listening as the feedback noises cut off when the girl shuts the window. I'm thinking this girl is going to be right back, so I get ready to resume the session again, but then I hear her faintly say something like, "Oh my God, no, 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 no." Then crash. All you hear is the sound of a window breaking, then the girl running across her webcam like a wave from the crashing sound. We're terrified. We have zero clue what's going on, which made it all the scarier. Like I thought it was a home invasion or something. I didn't know that her apartment was actually a couple of floors up, so unless it was like evil Spider-Man or something, but either way, the airwaves are just a mess of worried women anxiously asking this girl if she's okay, what's going on, should someone call the cops, all this panic chatter. And then about a minute goes by and there's even more smashing glass sounds coming from the client's feed. I keep thinking I'm about to see some hooded figure, claw hammer in hand, marching across the webcam towards his prey. But thank God nothing like that ever happened, but even then, what did happen was almost impossible to determine at the time. As I'm watching, I notice that the weird feedback noise is back and much louder this time. Then slowly, it just sort of morphs into a steady barking sound, which is when I realize what it is. It's people chanting something, some 4-syllable phrase, only I can't quite make out what it is. Meanwhile, my besieged client is calling the cops, trying to get someone out to her, while we're all making sure to stay in the call to keep an eye on her. It took us quite a while to get all the details on what actually happened, but when I heard, I was outraged. The girl in question lived in an apartment block in what some would call a gentrified area of Portland. A large protest happened to be going on past her apartment at the time, and it was not one of the peaceful ones. These idiots were throwing rocks at any residents that looked like they might house young professionals. I think they even wrecked a few bars and restaurants in the neighborhood too. My client just so happened to be unlucky enough to have them march past her apartment just as they started feeling mean. Like, I'm very much in favor of most of all the stuff that went down. I voted in favor of it, and I fully support people's right to protest. But I know for a fact that people used all the unrest in Portland this summer to just go out and live out some of their darkest fantasies. Those are the worst kind of people in my mind. Like, I just want to ask those guys, what did my client do? Why was her apartment targeted? She's not a cop or some stormtrooper. What in God's name were they thinking? But yeah, definitely the scariest moment of the summer for me, which is really saying something considering there's been a deadly virus going around. My client wasn't hurt, thank God, but she was left with quite a bill to get her windows replaced, all because some inconsiderate jerks decided to hijack a righteous protest to do some horrible, hateful things.
This happened just last week. I'm a female college student and I live in a dorm on campus. Due to COVID-19, we've had to have classes mainly online. I only have 2 in-person classes. Anyways, most of my online classes meet through Zoom. I had an econ class where we were having a meeting and the professor broke us into small groups to discuss a topic. There was probably between 50 to 100 kids in that class. I'm not really sure, but I know there was a lot, so we would go into these breakout rooms occasionally where there would be about 5 to 10 of us to discuss topics or do group work. As soon as we got into the groups, I noticed one of the kids in my group had on a creepy looking scream mask. I knew it was some kid trying to be funny, so I told him nice mask and then got on with the discussion. He didn't respond when the rest of us started talking and remained quiet the entire time. We all got kind of annoyed with him and I outright asked him if he was going to do anything. He still didn't answer and just stared at the screen. Eventually, I told him he should just leave. He stayed there and continued to be quiet. Class ended a short time after that. Later that day, I was on my laptop doing homework and I got a Zoom call from a name that I didn't recognize. It was early in the semester and I wanted to see who it was, so I accepted the call. It was the kid in the mask again. When I opened the call, he was just staring at the screen. I quickly turned my camera off. Then he said something in the chat. He outright stated that he wanted to kill me. I thought this must be one of my friends messing with me, although I was unsure of how they would be able to do all of this. I asked who it was, and the person lifted their mask just so I could see their mouth and a little bit of their nose. It wasn't much, but I didn't recognize it as anyone that I knew at all. Then they lowered their mask back down and ended the call. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of creeped out. I texted a few of my friends and told them about what had happened. Some of them thought it was funny, but others seemed to think it was a serious thing. At almost midnight, I was just about to go to bed when I got another Zoom call from the same person. I was pretty irritated at this point, and I answered. I immediately said to the person, whoever it was, that if this was a joke, it wasn't funny, and I was tired of their nonsense. Then I said if they called me again, I was going to report them. They didn't respond, but just stared at the screen. This time, I noticed that the person calling was not on a computer like before, but seemed to be on a phone and was walking. They didn't acknowledge me at all until they typed something in the chat. It said, "Look out your door." I went over to the door of my dorm room and peeked out the peephole. Sure enough, I saw the scream mask staring right back at me. I jumped back after seeing it. I asked the person, "Who are you?" They said to open the door. I told them they needed to leave now or I was going to call the police. I was hoping that would scare them off, but as soon as I said that, instead of leaving, they began trying to open the door. Thankfully, I had locked it. They knocked on the door, but then began jiggling it with the lock. It sounded like they were trying to pick it. My dorm building was fairly old and still used a lock and key instead of your student ID card like some buildings did, so I was afraid they might be able to get in. I decided to call the police. I picked up the phone and then called. They said they were on their way. The man in the mask continued to jiggle the lock. I sat in the back corner of the room just watching the knob jiggle, hoping that it wouldn't open. But about a minute later, my biggest fear came true, and I heard the lock click and saw the door slowly open up. The man in the mask walked in. I told him I had called the police. He didn't seem to care though. He slowly closed the door behind him and then started approaching me. As he was slowly walking towards me, he removed his mask fully from his head. It was a guy who looked to be college-aged, but I didn't recognize him at all. He kept getting slowly closer and closer. Then, I heard several footsteps coming to the doorway and saw the police. They were able to get the man before he got to me in just enough time. He turned out to actually be a student that went to the university and was actually in my class. It was the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me.